Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of myself and organizations I represent, thank you to the Global Pastors and Ministers Conference, and a special shout out to Dr. Jamila Mantilla for inviting me this afternoon. I'm just going to get right into it, and hopefully there'll be some questions at the end. If I am not for myself, who is for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? Sage words from Hillel in Pirkei Avot, and one of the main lessons that has driven me all throughout my adult life. I thought I would start this conversation by telling you a bit about me, how I came to be working at the United Nations, and some of the work I'm doing on anti-human trafficking. I grew up in a typical suburban household in blue-collar northern New Jersey. I went to some of the same secular schools as my mother and attended the same synagogue that her father had helped to establish in 1948. The major difference in my typical suburban household was that both my father and his mother, the only grandparent I knew, had survived the Holocaust. My father's experiences were not articulated in those days of my growing up, but it influenced everything from the food that we ate, anything that tasted good, to the people that we spent time with, family and friends that were kind to him when he came to the United States. Both parents instilled in me a sense of giving back to the community. My mother was active in the synagogue and in the northern New Jersey Jewish community. My father believed in Bershet, destiny. It was the reason my father made it through the Holocaust, the reason my grandmother survived both the Russian Revolution and the Holocaust, and the reason I survived the bombing of the World Trade Center on 9/11. It's the reason that after 9/11, I could pick up and try to continue my career with an international financial company on Wall Street. And it's the reason that I could no longer continue my career and instead chose to retire early so that I could figure out what was it that I was supposed to do. So very simply, I am blessed to have a husband that is supportive and also would continue his career so that I could figure it out. It took the summer, and then I read the book by Nick Kristof and his wife Cheryl Rudon, Half the Sky, where women and girls, against all odds and forms of oppression, including human trafficking, can change the dynamics and turn the world around. Moreover, there's an appendix at the back of the book that lists how the reader can help. I set about to figure out how I could help. My first attempt was to my alma mater, Douglas College, which is part of Rutgers University. Seems that I wasn't clear enough in articulating how I could make a difference, and surprised, there was no response. My second attempt was approaching Doris Shapiro, who was the former chief observer to the United Nations for the League of Women Voters. Doris had recently stepped down from the role and suggested that I represent the League at the Working Group on Girls, a coalition of UN-accredited NGOs that were dedicated to making sure girls' human rights were taken into account at the United Nations and that girls can live to their full potential. By Doris opening the door, it has led to 10 plus years at the United Nations, where on items of importance, door after door has been opened. At the Working Group on Girls, my business experience and drive made a difference. At first, it was rocky. My approach was different than my colleagues that came from the non-business environments and spend time getting to know each other and build relationships. My approach was, let's go. Let's get to the business at hand and what are we accomplishing? You know, it's a funny thing about the UN system, including the NGOs involved with it. There's an awful lot of talking within the system, and the goals and accomplishments weren't the priorities. The Millennium Development Goals, which were in effect at the time, had been developed by the member states, not civil society. Identifying progress was done, but it was almost an afterthought. But my colleagues and I worked together, opened another door, and formed the Girls Against Violence Committee and studied the issue of human trafficking and other forms of violence that are perpetrated uniquely against girls. I wanted to use my business experience, which was all about understanding goals, priorities, designing plans, implementing those plans, and measuring effectiveness to not just reiterate the problems of the world, but to solve them. I knew that focus and persistence are important, otherwise you get lost. And I knew that it was important to understand the problem and really identify the root cause. So when it came to human trafficking, especially exploitation and coercion, it seemed to me that if we really wanted to end it, the way to do that was by ending the demand for victims, as well as the illicit profiteering for traffickers and enablers. Otherwise, at $150 billion plus industry, it would be a never-ending cycle. Working together with the UN Special Representative on Violence Against Children, we opened a door and developed a strategy to raise awareness around exploitation of major events, including the World Cup and the Super Bowl. Further, we work to coordinate the awareness campaign with those that are involved in the business of enabling the exploitation at major events: cab drivers, hotels, advertisers like Backpage, just to name a few, as well as those responsible for responding and enforcing laws, and those government agencies that are responsible for developing policies that help the victims. The one-page strategy document, my business background tries to keep it simple and clear, was then used to advocate with member states in developing policies to end child exploitation. Brazil and New Jersey, my home state, adopted the strategy for the 2014 World Cup and Super Bowl. Through another door, New Jersey took it a step further and reestablished an anti-human trafficking task force within the Attorney General's office. My work at the United Nations led to my participation on the New Jersey Attorney General's Human Trafficking Task Force, where we affect policies and procedures intra-government to support prevention, protection, and prosecution. The coordinated approach includes multiple government agencies, law enforcement agencies on local, state, and federal levels, NGOs, all working together to act within the New Jersey community in stopping human trafficking and aiding victims. Door after door regarding the anti-human trafficking work opened. The Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons formed. We worked with many member states and UN agencies to raise awareness about how demand for and allowing enablers to flourish with impunity drives the illicit profiteering. We shared best practices concerning fighting exploitation at major events, including the 2014 World Cup and Super Bowl, and how member states were working to stop the demand for human trafficking. With the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals, more about that later, we were able to form an NGO coalition for Alliance 8.7, which helped to formulate working together with the International Labor Organization, understanding how the statistics of the $150 billion illicit industry and victimization of 24.9 million people annually were gathered. In conjunction with the ILO, the SRSG to prevent violence against children, and CSTIP, our latest door opener was an expert discussion featuring 24 international experts from government, business, law enforcement, and NGOs, identifying what can be done by each sector to bankrupt the business of human trafficking. I thought that it would be a good idea to provide an example regarding this project. To understand the background, it is important to know that forced labor and human trafficking are a violation of human rights, as well as a crime that impacts millions around the world. According to the International Labor Organization, ILO, it victimizes, quote, an estimated 40.3 million people, including the 24.9 million in forced labor and 15 million in forced marriage. 1 out of every 4 victims of modern slavery is a child. There are 190 states of the United Nations or parties to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, also known as the Palermo Protocols, and its 3 protocols, including the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. Many countries have also enacted national laws prohibiting human trafficking and modern slavery. Framed by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights developed in 2011, and the Children's Rights and Business Principles formed in 2012, 21 states have formally adopted national plans on human rights, which includes how business can support children's rights as part of their corporate social responsibility. A national plan on human rights on business and human rights presents a great opportunity for strengthening multi-stakeholders collaboration to achieve progress on the prevention and elimination of human trafficking and child modern slavery. Despite all efforts, these crimes have continued to proliferate unfettered throughout the world. Major focuses have been on aiding the victims after the crime is committed and to develop programs to prevent abuse on the most vulnerable. While these are laudable efforts, they obviously have not stopped crimes from occurring. Several strategies have been promoted by some member states, international intergovernmental organizations, and the corporate sector to prevent human trafficking. These approaches miss an underlying concept of simple economics, that even if the 40.3 million victims were all to be rescued today, tomorrow there's a whole new set of victims, as it is too lucrative an industry. As mentioned, at least $150 billion plus in annual illicit profits, according to the ILO. There have been efforts throughout the world in preventing human trafficking by understanding who is paying for modern slavery and then raising awareness or exerting penalties to deter the buyers. Some examples include examining supply service chain to determine if forced labor is being used in the production of corporate goods, awarding government contracts to companies that demonstrate zero tolerance for human trafficking, utilizing anti-corruption practices in making financial investment decisions, arresting buyers and profiteers of human trafficking victim services through follow the money techniques, informing the public of corporations that do not demonstrate zero tolerance for human trafficking, and raising awareness of cultural norms that perpetuate forced labor and trafficking. These examples are just the tip of the iceberg regarding what is needed to end forced labor and trafficking, especially of children. The lack of awareness by the public and private sector can sometimes result in investing in industries and/or locations that use people, including children, as modern-day slaves, while some governments enable forced labor and trafficking to flourish through corruption and impunity. So what to do about it? As I mentioned, the Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons, CSTIP, which is a coalition of UN-accredited NGOs, convened in partnership with the International Labor Organization, the United Nations Special Representative to the Secretary General, Violence Against Children, the permanent missions of Albania and Australia to the United Nations, ECPAT USA, the Episcopal Church, International Association of Women in Radio and Television, the League of Women Voters of the United States, and Sisters of Charity Federation to conduct a 3-phased project. Phase one was a panel discussion on December 1st, 2020 at the United Nations discussing why and how to bankrupt the business of human trafficking. His Excellency Mitch Fifield, who is the Australian ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations, Dr. Najat Ma'ala Majid, the special representative to the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, Mrs. Beata Andres, the special representative and director of the ILO Office for the United Nations, and I joined Ms. Connie Zymak, journalist and international conference moderator, and identified how governments, UN agencies, business and civil society all have a role to play in stopping this $150 billion illicit industry. On April 7th, 2021, the core planners convened phase two. 24 international experts, as I mentioned before, met and provided recommendations regarding pragmatic solutions to bankrupt the business of human traffickers. The experts were from various sectors, including United Nations agencies, government, private sector, academia, and NGOs. Each breakout group discussed identifying solutions, hurdles, and best practices on how the area could bankrupt the business of human trafficking. Although their deliberations were done in 4 groups, with the business sector, law enforcement, judiciary, governments, and civil society, not surprisingly, there was agreement on a large number of strategies for moving forward. And the last phase, phase 3, is a series of recommendations. It is the culmination of both programs and is intended to be a pragmatic guide in developing policies, implementing solutions, areas for research, advocacy work, and most of all, partnerships amongst all sectors in stopping the supply of victims by going after the driver of human trafficking, the illicit profits that traffickers value. One second here. No one sector, government, NGO, UN agency has the solution for ending human trafficking. Further, as one of our experts mentioned, we, quote, can't arrest our way out of this problem, end quote, nor can we solve the problem by focusing on any one solution. Therefore, underpinning every recommendation is the need for multi-sectoral collaboration, sharing of data, and measuring results. Sounds simple, but it isn't. For to collaborate successfully takes first and foremost political will of leadership, specifically on the following tenets. Number 1, the universal definition of human trafficking, which is incorporated into member states' laws. The Palermo Protocols provides universal definition, which is law, and has been ratified by 190 out of the 193 total members of the United Nations. Many of the member states have incorporated the Palermo Protocols into their laws regarding modern-day slavery and human trafficking. Further, there is a strong correlation between corruption and human trafficking. Incorporating corruption into the universal definition provides an avenue to go after those that also profit from the crime, whether or not they directly participate in committing the crime. Number 2, in order for data to be useful, i.e. information, there must be universal definition of each data item, and it must be accessible and readable by systems, standard formats for us techie folks. Our law enforcement experts and business experts both expounded on suspicious activity reports, SARS, which is required of financial institutions as an example. The SARS form was developed by the US government employees under jurisdiction of law. It is usually completed by a financial institution compliance employee and transmitted eventually to law enforcement employees. None of the employees involved in the developing of the report, completing the report, transmitting and using the report are part of the same sector, nor do they collaborate on what should be a useful tool to identify possible human trafficking patterns or prioritize investigations. Number 3, in order to understand what is working in ending human trafficking, we need to measure how each approach worked against the common definition of success. If the success is measured primarily by how many people are arrested and convicted of human trafficking laws, or by how we can prevent people from becoming victimized, then we are spending a lot of time, effort, and resource in unsuccessful practices as the illicit profits are growing and more people are needed to support those profits. If, however, success is measured by putting traffickers out of business, then our resources can be redeployed to other more successful avenues. For example, it would be considered a success and should be captured in both the UNODC, the United Nations Office of Drug and Crimes, and the US Trafficking in Persons reports that X number of trafficking networks were disrupted via prosecution and conviction, or manufacturers no longer use slave labor in their supply service chain. Each sector has a role to play in helping to end this human rights crisis. The recommendations have been summarized, and a draft report is currently being reviewed by the experts. Our work at the United Nations on bankrupting the business of human trafficking continues by trying to raise awareness, talk about best practices, hurdles on policy implementation, and advocating for a paradigm shift regarding tactics to end this scourge against 24.9 million people annually victimized in forced labor. We would like to utilize the United Nations to extend jurisdictional reaches to reflect the global nature of the crime by establishing global law, measurement standards, standardizing data to enable data sharing, providing a global system regarding best practices and results in bankrupting the business of human trafficking, also assisting in collaboration amongst multi-sectors engaged in policy making, implementation, and monitoring of results. But this conversation isn't about me. It's really about you and the influences that you have on your communities to change this world for the better. There's a saying at the United Nations, quote, think globally, act locally, end quote. By working within your communities, you have the opportunities to influence action. The United Nations can provide a wealth of research, expert recommendations, and information that you can use with changing the paradigms in your community. Through the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, the world has turned the talk at the United Nations into action needed to change paradigms. Developed in 2015, the SDGs are 17 major goals to be accomplished by 2030, identified by civil society through surveys that were circulated and administered by the United Nations. More than 5 million people from all over the globe participated in those surveys. The General Assembly formally adopted the SDGs, and you can use all of the research, data, best practices, and latest policies regarding almost any topic affecting people throughout the world just by clicking on sdgs.un.org. www.ccpam.org/goals. Is your congregation struggling with hunger? How about violence perpetrated against children? These two topics and a myriad of others are covered within the 17 goals and 169 targets within the SDGs, used to mobilize coordinated efforts around the world. Need to understand how Africa, Asia, or North America deals with these topics? There's 1,304 publications, including a synopsis of the best practices from 2020, and thousands of events covering how communities all over the world like yours are dealing with problems covered by the SDGs, as well as the specifics of ending hunger or violence against children. Why reinvent the wheel when communities are making progress on utilizing techniques that are working? Changing our world for the better requires not just research and a focus on accomplishing goals, but a true regard for human rights. Yet so much of our approach is to build fear into our institutions and demean those that are different. While the UN has in its Declaration of Human Rights, we the people should be able to live without fear and reach full potential regardless of gender, religion, age, race, physical limitations, or who we love. It still isn't a basic for everyone. When hatred is spewed regarding politics, gender, race, religion, is it condoned? Do you remain silent or do you speak out? When violence is perpetrated in the name of religion, is it condoned? Do you remain silent or do you speak out? When a child is abused, do you counsel silence, impunity for the perpetrator, or do you speak out? When a wife is beaten by her husband, do you counsel silence, impunity for the perpetrator, or do you speak out? The earlier a light is shown by speaking out on hatred, threats, and violence, the easier it is to stop. When people of good intent remain silent, it leads to violence and killings of others, like people like my grandfather and my aunt, as well as the 6 million Jews and millions of others who just happen to have a disability, were born into the Romanis, had a different philosophy, or loved the wrong person that perished in the Holocaust. And if you think this is ancient history, then let's look at the lessons of today. LGBTQI, racism, January 6th, Haiti, Uyghurs, Taliban, and yes, rising anti-Semitism. Did you know that according to studies done by the United Nations, 1 out of every 3 women have experienced personal violence at some time in their lives? As pastors and ministers, you have the opportunity to truly change that paradigm each and every day. Further, as leaders of your community, you have the opportunity to root out those systemic practices like honor killings from happening in the first place. By speaking out for a woman to live in peace in her own household, to not fear her husband, and to reach her full potential, for a girl child to have a full education, and for husbands, brothers, and fathers to respect the women and girls in their lives rather than demean them or expect blind obedience, you will change the paradigm in your community. And if you decide to add in tolerance of others that believe differently than you do, you just may find that it changes the paradigm in more than your community. So what are we waiting for? Do we sit by silently and allow those that wish to harm or profit from exploitation to work with impunity? Do we sit by silently, expecting government and or others to fix all the problems? Or do we sit by silently, not trusting that when God made man and women in God's image, that it meant waiting until we are dead rather than helping ourselves and others in this world? Hillel's words, regardless of what religion you practice, are sage. If I am not for myself, who is for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? Thank you.